Look closely at this printed text of Mark chapter 1, verse 2 from the King James Bible. It reads, "As it is written in the prophets." But if you open a modern translation, like the ESV, that exact same sentence reads, "As it is written in Isaiah the prophet." This discrepancy does not come from modern translators arguing over the nuance of a specific Greek word. The ESV and the King James are translating two entirely different underlying Greek texts. Resolving why these texts differ requires textual criticism. This is the forensic science of identifying the exact original words an author wrote, tracing them back through centuries of diverging historical copies. To solve the anomaly at Mark 1:2, we have to discard which version we might prefer or which phrase feels more familiar to us. Instead, we must rely on a strict probabilistic methodology. The data set for the New Testament is immense. We have roughly 6,000 surviving Greek manuscripts, plus early translations and early church father citations. The complication with this sheer volume of data is that every round of manual copying across 1,500 years introduced human error. Scribes accidentally dropped words, intentionally smoothed out grammar, and altered the textual stream. To cut through the noise, scholars rely on the master question of the discipline. When evaluating two competing readings, they ask, if one reading is assumed to be the original, does it make the existence of the other reading explicable? Finding the reading that best explains the other requires us to cross-reference two independent datasets, the external evidence of the physical manuscripts and the internal evidence of scribal habits. Textual criticism is a rigorous process of reverse engineering. By identifying the specific causality of scribal behavior, we can trace the branches back to the root. The first dataset is external evidence. This is the raw, physical data provided by the surviving manuscripts themselves. The defining rule of external evidence is that manuscripts must be weighed, not merely counted. A handful of very early, geographically separated manuscripts will override 1,000 later manuscripts that share a single lineage. Scholars divide these lineages into families. The gold standard is the Alexandrian family. Originating in Egypt, these manuscripts are early, careful, and highly conservative. Their scribes valued strict transmission over making the text read smoothly. By contrast, the Byzantine family represents the vast majority of all surviving manuscripts. These were mass-produced much later, concentrated heavily in the Greek-speaking Eastern Roman Empire from the 9th century onward. The Byzantine text is a highly valuable historical witness. However, because it reflects centuries of continuous copying, it represents a later, heavily edited form of the Greek text compared to the early Alexandrian papyri. This gives us the principle of triangulation. If a specific reading appears in early manuscripts from widely separated parts of the ancient world, it almost certainly predates all of those regional copies. Here we see the Sinaitic manuscript. This physical text, along with early Alexandrian uncials, Old Latin texts, and early Coptic translations, all clearly read Isaiah the prophet. Now look at a later Byzantine manuscript. This handwritten minuscule script is characteristic of the later mass-copied tradition. This specific medieval stream provides almost the entirety of the support for the reading in the prophets. The geographical triangulation is stark. The Isaiah reading spans Egypt, Italy, and multiple early church fathers. The prophets reading is heavily isolated to a singular, later medieval cluster in the East. Applying the rules of external evidence yields a definitive result. Based strictly on its early date and wide geographical footprint, Isaiah the prophet is the older physical text. The second data set is internal evidence. The first half of this involves transcriptional probabilities, building a predictive model of exactly how copyists behaved over time. Scribes were human editors. When they encountered a text, their instinct was to clarify it. They fixed grammar, harmonized parallel accounts, and expanded phrases to ensure the reader wouldn't be confused. Because of this editorial habit, scholars employ the rule of lectio brevior. The shorter reading is generally preferred. Scribes routinely expanded texts for clarity, but they almost never deliberately deleted words. This introduces the paradox of lectio difficilior. The harder reading is preferred. Scribes smoothed rough grammar, making the rougher text original. The exception is I skip, where a scribe's eye jumped between similar words, accidentally dropping the text between them. When we apply the rule of the harder reading to Mark 1:2, we find a massive complication. The quotation that immediately follows verse 2 is actually a composite of two different Old Testament books, Malachi and Isaiah. Put yourself in the position of an ancient scribe. You are copying a quotation that clearly begins with Malachi, but the author has labeled it as it is written in Isaiah. To a copyist, this looks like an embarrassing factual error. Changing Isaiah to the prophets removes the inaccuracy entirely. No scribe would look at the perfectly safe phrase, the prophets, and decide to deliberately introduce a historically inaccurate citation. The second half of internal evidence relies on intrinsic probabilities. This requires evaluating what the specific apostolic author was actually likely to have written, based on their unique literary style and rhetorical goals. If we look at Mark's opening strategy, his entire prologue is built around Isaiah 40. The voice crying out, the wilderness, the preparation of the way, these are distinctly Isaianic themes. Mark is naming Isaiah as the controlling prophetic lens for his entire gospel. This was a known literary device in early Jewish writing. When combining multiple quotes, the author cited the dominant source. He was not providing a modern bibliography. The later scribe, reading literally, missed Mark's sophisticated theological intent. Thinking he was correcting a mistake, he physically altered the manuscript to fix it. By attempting to be helpful, later copyists completely erased the intentional framework Mark had built into the very first sentence of his work. We now have two converging datasets. To solve the variant at Mark 1:2, we run the external and internal variables back through the master question of the discipline. If Isaiah was original, can we explain how the prophets came to exist? Yes, a scribe smoothed the difficult quote. But if the prophets was original, can we explain how Isaiah came to exist? No. Scribes wouldn't intentionally introduce a glaring textual difficulty. The data points converge perfectly. Isaiah the prophet mathematically and logically explains the existence of the Byzantine variant. That is why it earns its place in modern critical texts. Discovering variations in the manuscript tradition does not mean the text is lost. The specific patterns of those scribal errors provide the exact map scholars need to trace their way back to the source. By rigorously prioritizing the older, harder readings, textual criticism cuts through centuries of well-meaning human intervention. It is the ultimate mechanism for recovering the exact historical prose left behind by the authors.